Hey guys, it's Sarah from Just My Typewriter, and I really love flea markets. My favorite flea market is the Golden Nugget Flea Market in Lambertville, New Jersey, and I decided to go again, and every time I go to this flea market, I do come home with a typewriter. I started my adventure, as all good adventures do, with breakfast at a bagel shop on the way, because New Jersey bagels just hit different. And then I did go to Lambertville's Golden Nugget. Now this is open year-round, which is not like a lot of flea markets in my area. They tend to close for winter and fall, but this one is open all year round. I've been here maybe 3 or 4 times. Every time I go, I find at least one typewriter and I always seem to buy it. There were a few things here that I was interested in, but it was a little bit light for the flea market, especially on a nice summer day. I did run into one typewriter. This is a Royal H or Royal Victory model. I have one of these already. It was my grandfather's typewriter, and it is a mainstay permanent in my collection. I thought I was going to get skunked on the typewriter front outside of this, but I did find at the last table of the last aisle, which is always how it seems to go, a Brother XL 1010. Now the seller wanted $30 for this, and I talked him down to $20, and I walked away with this very interesting little keyboard. Well, typewriter. What's interesting about it is it has a Spanish keyboard. But the day didn't stop there. I also went to the town of Lambertville, which has a few antique stores, including the People's Store in downtown Lambertville. This is a huge antique mall with lots of very interesting items in it. It's a little bit higher end on the antique market. Like a lot of antique malls, these items can stay here for longer, so the prices do tend to go up. But I did see a few items in here that I was interested in, including some Pyrex. I've been looking at Pyrex a little bit more for a resale perspective. Every time I go somewhere, I do check the patterns and the prices they have on those patterns. I have recently acquired a few pieces of Pyrex and I'm looking to resell, so these are good information trips for me. I like to check out what's there and what they have on it. I also did see these Cessna chairs. I love mid-century modern things, and the chairs that are made in the Cessna style are so in that aesthetic. I really love seeing these in person, and if you're interested in learning more about the Cessna chair, there's a really interesting furniture video that I'll list down below for you on the history of the Cessna chair. I also ran into these Dorothy Thorpe glasses, or I think they're Dorothy Thorpe glasses. They're those mid-century glasses that have that silver dripping down the sides. These have this weird etched glitter pattern in them, and I did just recently see these like a week before I went to the flea market, so I'm interested in learning a little bit more about glassware. And of course I ran into some typewriters. I almost always find a typewriter in an antique mall. It's like a sixth sense. I did see this really interesting repainted Royal Quiet Deluxe. It had this beautiful blue color to it, but what I found really interesting was that it was still textured. I find it really difficult to get the texture right on a repainted machine. Now maybe the finish was brown before, like a lot of the Royal Quiet Deluxes, and they just painted directly over it, but often when I repaint machines, it's because their paint is damaged, and with a textured surface, you have to sand down things, and I'm not quite sure yet how to get that texture back. So I thought this paint job, while not my style personally, was really professional looking and well done. I also ran into this Hermes 2000 for $350. I've seen a couple of these Hermes 2000s. This is in the darker green color, that gray color. That's just not a price that's gonna work for me. But I also ran into an Echelon typewriter. This is another Brother typewriter. And to me, this looks a lot like my Montgomery Ward 44T or 440T, which is a typewriter I had and gave to another collector. So it was interesting to see these two typewriters here as well. The Hermes at $350 and the Brother at $80. So someone did some Googling there. But at the end of the day, I came home with a Brother XL 1010, which is from the 1970s. So I paid $20 for this typewriter. It is in great condition. The only thing I had to do to it was clean it and put in a new ribbon. That's typically what I like in typewriters when they're around that $15 to $20 mark and all they need is a clean and a ribbon. That's a really easy buy for me. But I was gonna pass on this typewriter until I looked closer at the keys. The keyboard itself looks out of order, and there's some additional keys on here and reordering on here that kind of drew me to it. I've never had a typewriter with a keyboard in another language. I have run into them. I ran into a Hebrew Hermes typewriter when I was in Adamstown, and I've also seen a Turkish Olivetti typewriter, and I always think their keyboards are so interesting. I don't have a lot of use for them personally, but it is cool to see a machine like this out there, especially in the United States. We don't always run into different keyboards. So I looked at the keyboard on this, realized it was a Spanish keyboard, and I had to buy it. Now, what's interesting about the Brother typewriters, these were made in Japan and they made quite a few models, and they often made models for other companies or for other stores and would rebadge them, which means they would make the base model and then something like a department store would come in and put their label on it. Montgomery Ward's a really great example. I've had these before. The body's a Brother machine, but the label is from a department store. But this machine was not actually made by Brother, it was made by Messa, which is in Portugal, and this was another typewriter manufacturer who made products for Royal, ABC, department stores, as well as just this model for Brother. I looked into Messa a little bit in the typewriter database, and they do have models dating back to 1966, but it seems like they mostly made models from the 60s and the 70s, including things like Safari variants. So if you see some of those odder 1970s Royal Safaris, they were made by Messa. Now, one thing I've been getting better at is when I find a typewriter or need some help doing some research, I have been posting it to my Instagram because you guys seem to have such a wealth of information and it really helps me do my research for new projects. I did post a picture of this while I was out flea marketing and I did get some feedback back, and one of them was from one of my typewriter gurus, Will Davis, who is a console expert, and he messaged me about this typewriter with some interesting information. So according to Will, Brother machines like this were made at the Messa plant in Portugal, but they were rebadged and fire saled, which means they were put down at a really low price. And some of them have Royal names on them and some of them have Brother names on them because Royal did the same thing. They made some of their typewriters in that factory, and when Brother acquired the factory, they put their badge on it and sold them at really cheap prices, which makes sense because typically department store machines are sold at a lower rate than your name brand typewriter brands. So if Brother went in and sold a bunch of these that were made in that department store body, they might have sold them for cheaper rates. Interestingly enough, he has one that came in a Royal case with no badge, very similar to mine. Mine does have the Brother badge across the front, but the ribbon spools say Royal on them. So it seems like when Brother bought out the plant, they were just trying to get rid of a bunch of those typewriters there, and they were badging certain things, putting Royal branding on others, and just kind of getting rid of all of these models. I didn't see as many examples of mine in the typewriter database specifically, but I did find a few from the 1970s. These are all listed around 1976, so I'm estimating that's when my model is from. The other thing that Will mention to me is that these do look very similar to other models sold by department stores like Sears. So the Sears Malibu and the Sears Capri look very similar to my Brother XL1010. That makes sense if you're using the same base bodies from the Messa factory or Messa factory. They would all look kind of similar. I do have a Sears Malibu currently listed in my local area for sale, and I thought it looked very similar to the body I have here on the XL1010. Now it's called the XL1010 because they did have a few models here, the XL1010, I think 12 and 16. The last two numbers refer to the length of the carriage. So the length of this carriage is about 10 inches because it's a 1010. I also decided to do a little bit more research because I don't know much about the Messa, Brother factory convergence here, and I did find another article from typewriter.org, which I will list down below in the description, but they mentioned that in the 70s, Brother made a few models out of this factory, as did Royal, and they also made models that were for Sears, so the Chevron and the Capri. And one thing they mentioned in the article is that they weren't really sure why Brother would partner with something like the Messa factory in order to make models when they clearly were already doing very well for themselves in their Japanese factory. I think this info from typewriter.org and also from Will Davis kind of makes sense together, that Brother bought out the Messa typewriter factory and then just rebadged what they already had made there. And it's not a bad model for a typewriter. It is very similar in construction to some of the Brothers I've had before, where the bottom plate comes off completely. The typewriter's kind of in the unit itself, but it's bolted to the unit rather than being integrated with the side panels. The panels do come off the sides. It is very easy to take apart and work on. The top here fits into some brackets, so you kind of have to push it down a little bit. The bottom comes off, the back plate comes off, the sides are separate. It's not a bad construction, and it is similar to what I think of when I think of Brother typewriters, but I will say the typing experience is a little less sturdy than the Brothers I've had in my collection before. It is a lot more like an ultra portable, although I think it's a little bit heavier than the Brother Wizard True Type I've had before, but the experience is still rather good for a typewriter of this age. You're just not going to get them to feel the same as they did in the 50s when you're using materials that are plastic or a little bit more lightweight for a portable typewriter. That being said, I did do a quick little type test for you, so here's that. I think it's a really interesting little model. I love the typewriters from the 60s and the 70s from a design perspective. I think they're so interesting to look at. Yes, they look like a 70s couch, but something about that is so interesting to me. It's a very neutral color palette. It's a little bit more angular. It's not as rounded and industrial looking as something from the 1950s, but the style of it very much gives it a retro feel, especially in like a modern market. Is this a model I would typically buy for myself and keep? Probably not, but I was interested to see what it was like to have a keyboard from a different language, but also to have a typewriter from a different factory. I've had typewriters from Portugal before. My Royal Sabre was from Portugal, and so I imagine that this was probably made in a similar factory. And it is interesting to have a typewriter that there don't seem to be very many of. That being said, I don't speak Spanish, and I had a difficult time trying to use this keyboard to write in English. So I do think that I will be trying to find a home for this keyboard where it's a typewriter. I do think I'll be trying to find a home for this typewriter where someone can use it for its intended purpose. I find sometimes that collectors want typewriters with different keyboards just to have them, and for me that doesn't really work for my collection. I like everything to be very useful. I remember back to the Hebrew typewriter and how fascinated I was to find that. Someone did message me about that typewriter and I sent them to where it was, and I'm hoping it's getting used by an environment that'll really utilize that well and appreciate it rather than just being bought for the rarity of it. I think it's really important to look at these machines as tools. So for me, I'm going to be trying to find someone who speaks Spanish and writes in Spanish so they can have this typewriter and use it for that intended purpose. That to me is where this typewriter belongs. So that's my next kind of mission for this typewriter. I will say I do like trying these models, and it's always fun to find another project, and this flea market always seems to give me a project. If you're interested in more typewriter content, I do have some other videos on this YouTube channel, as well as an Instagram at just.my.typewriter. And I thank you all so much for watching, and remind you, you're just my typewriter.